Hello and welcome to the series on India's wars since its independence. This is the second part of the explainer on what happened when India chose to intervene militarily in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s. As has been explained in the earlier video, that India decided a military intervention after a lot of pressure came to be on New Delhi from the government of the state of Tamil Nadu, since the Tamils of Sri Lanka, who were largely habitating the areas of north and east of Sri Lanka, were under huge pressure from the Sri Lankan army. Sri Lankan army started the operations when they had just 11,000 people, but soon they beefed up their forces to 48,000 people. India sent in a peacekeeping force which was told in an ambiguous way that, oh, you just have to go and take a surrender and it'll all be over in less than a week. But clearly, this operation was going to last for more than a year as things began to unfold. India's peacekeeping force was neither trained nor equipped for the kind of operations that were to unfold. Sri Lanka, as many would know, is largely a forested land, thick jungles, riverine terrain, undulating terrain, and the role of the peacekeeping force was largely going to be on the island and not to come onto the island as 54 Div, which was sent in there for peacekeeping, was trained to do. 54 Division was Indian Army's reserve divisions, and one of its primary roles was amphibious operations launched from ships and other maritime vehicles to come onto a coastline and then occupy territory, create bridgeheads for more forces to come and go in further. However, here the operations, as it turned out, were clearly going to be counterinsurgency. India had at least 3 divisions. Each division, as I've said earlier, is about 7,500 upwards of trained and armed men who are the fighting element of the division. There is another tail element which is that big or even bigger, which includes logistic forces, etc., etc. So India could have used its divisions which were there in India's northeast, long experienced in battling insurgency. But India chose because the urgency of the situation required a quick deployment of forces. Why it was urgent is never been understood, because the signals that this kind of an operation might take place had begun to appear on the skyline very clearly by April-May 1987. And finally, when the fighting began in Sri Lanka between Indian forces and the Tamil resistance, was sometime in October 1987, clearly almost a 6-month window period where troops could have been armed, trained, equipped for the kind of role they were going in. Anyway, the eagerness of General Sundarji, the army chief, to prove a point suddenly led to a lot of ad hocism. One of the big ad hocisms that still hurts every military assessment that is made on the Sri Lankan operations to those of us who studied it, that why were troops picked up in bits and pieces from all over India and pushed into Sri Lanka? See, the Indian army, like most armies, operates in a system of units, that is a battalion working as part of a brigade working as part of a division. So a division has about 9 battalions, a brigade has 3 battalions, and the battalions have 4 companies. These are all trained and all the time organized to work as part of a larger synchronized group. You cannot pick up one battalion unless it's a special forces battalion, which often operates in isolation, and just throw them into battle under new commanders, new units, with no prior training, with no prior coordination. It's expecting too much out of troops. But this is precisely the one big mistake that was done. The second thing that was done was troops were sent in without clarity on what's their role. Initially, their role was to take on the militants of the Tamils and get them to surrender. When they refused to surrender, then fight them in full-fledged frontal battles. But fight them for what? That role was not clarified. First, India said, we want to limit Tamil military power as a force that could challenge the Sri Lankan forces which were running the country. But subsequently, there was some thought about creating the Tamils as a counter to Sinhala domination in Sri Lanka. And eventually, neither of the two roles were achieved, and Indian troops were looking at a pullout from there with having fought the entire set of battles in Sri Lanka with one arm tied behind their back. Lots of tough battles took place. Lots of stories are there. There is one story of a Mahar unit which was thrown in from Lucknow to Chennai, Chennai to Colombo, Colombo, and asked to go and meet up with the rest of the units somewhere near Jaffna, but nobody came to meet them because messages were not being passed in time. And they spent 5 days dug in a paddy field with water up to their nose line and hiding in the daytime so that the LTTE snipers wouldn't pick them up one by one through telescopic sights. Villagers there were working with the Tamil Tigers to warn them whenever Indian Army troops came. So whenever troop patrols came, the villagers started ringing temple bells. That was a sign that Indian units are coming. Eventually, this unit managed to get pulled out by a patrol they ran into, and what followed thereafter was a complete sense of unhappiness amongst the troops, because back home in India, nobody respected or appreciated the work they were doing. It was an operation that had gone awry. It was an operation that was botched up at many levels. And even till today, unfortunately, the Indian Army is secretive about what happened in Sri Lanka, though many books have been written and accounts have been given by those who fought there, because they don't want to declassify it, because they're trying to prepare a storyline that would be acceptable. Finally, what the Indian Army discovered in Sri Lanka, the rough part of battling militants like the LTTE. For example, IED, improvised explosive device, which we hear more about in Kashmir now, had come into being as a term of usage in Sri Lanka. These were huge containers filled with explosives and a lot of metal pieces like nuts and bolts, and they could even throw 40-50 ton tanks, huge tanks the size of a building, in the air. And tanks were being thrown up. An anti-tank mine only lifts you off the ground and breaks your track. But here people saw huge tanks going up in the air like a Hollywood or a Bollywood movie. And you had armored personal carriers that were being thrown up. Troops were fighting the same guys they had trained earlier to resist the Sri Lankan forces. Now the Indian Army was pitched against them. And by end 1988, the casualty figures of the Indian Army was already in excess of 900. By the time India decided to pull out its troops, because Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was gone, a new Prime Minister was there, VP Singh, and he took a decision in consonance with the new leader of Sri Lanka, Mr. Premadasa, who replaced Jayawardene, that India must pull out. Many heaved a sigh of relief, but 1,155 Indian soldiers had died battling the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers for a cause nobody really knew what it was. Worse still, when the Sri Lankans built a memorial to the Indian soldier well after the conflict, the Indian diplomatic elements in the Indian mission in Sri Lanka did not go to inaugurate that memorial for 2 years. Nobody wanted to be associated with a war that people wanted to forget. But the Indian soldier fought this conflict, which was an inglorious war, gallantly and did his bit to put his life on the line to send India's message to its neighborhood. Unfortunately, the strategic message that came out of this was that India, at least then, was not suitably equipped to take on overseas intervention and come out of it with a success. In a small way, it was India's Vietnam.